In the southeastern United States in Florida, there grows a very strange plant that has been the subject of a real medical controversy for over a century. At first glance, there is nothing special about it at all. It is a small palm tree that usually barely rises above the knee and grows almost at the ground. Its leaves resemble wide, green fans, and in autumn, small dark berries appear on its branches, which over time become almost black. This plant is called Serenoa ripens, although most people know it by its simpler name, saw palmetto. The word ripens means creeping because the plant's trunk grows horizontally along the ground. Today, these berries are sold in thousands of pharmacies and stores around the world. Millions of men buy them, hoping to relieve the symptoms of an enlarged prostate. But if you ask American doctors whether saw palmetto really helps, you'll likely hear a pretty simple answer. Studies have shown that its effectiveness is not supported. In Europe, however, the approach to saw palmetto was different, as it continued to be used as a medicinal product. In Germany, France, and Italy, doctors continue to prescribe the extract of this plant and have done so for decades. Therefore, a completely logical question arises. How can the same plant be considered a useless supplement in one part of the world and a full-fledged medicine in another? To understand this, we need to go back far into the past, before the advent of modern clinical research and pharmaceutical companies. Long before scientists began studying saw palmetto in laboratories, the people who lived in these lands already knew well what was hidden inside its dark berries. This story begins on the Florida plains, where saw palmetto has been growing for thousands of years, in places where its dense thickets cover huge areas of land and have long become part of the local landscape. And the most interesting thing is that knowledge about this plant never actually disappeared completely. It simply became divided between two different systems of medicine, one that continued to use the plant and one that eventually came to distrust it. To understand why this plant ever attracted people's attention, you first need to see it in the wild. Palmetto is not a rare exotic plant that grows somewhere deep in the jungle. There is so much of it in Florida that locals joke. If there is a piece of land, then palmetto is probably growing there. Its thickets stretch through pine forests, sandy plains, and open fields, sometimes occupying vast areas. From the outside, it looks like an endless sea of green fans covering the ground between the trees. Most plants remain quite low, rarely growing taller than 1 meter. But the most important thing is hidden underground. Saw palmetto has long horizontal trunks that slowly creep along the soil surface and gradually form dense colonies. Sometimes one such plant can occupy tens of meters, although from the outside it looks like it is just many individual bushes. Some botanists believe that the oldest colonies may exist for hundreds of years. But there is one feature that makes this plant truly unusual: its connection with fire. Florida is a region where wildfires occur regularly. Lightning often sets fire to dry grass and pine forests, and such fires have been part of the local ecosystem long before humans arrived. For many plants, fire means the end, but for saw palmetto, it's a different story. When a fire passes through its thickets, the leaves are almost completely burned. At first glance, it seems that everything is destroyed, but underground the plant remains alive. Its roots and stems survive the fire, and after a few weeks, new leaves begin to emerge from the charred ground. This is why saw palmetto is considered one of the most resilient plants in this region. Every autumn, small oval berries appear on its branches. At first they are green, then they turn yellow, then dark purple, and finally almost black. To humans, these berries look quite strange. Their flavor is often described as a strange mixture of cheese, pepper, and sweet fruit. But for animals, it's one of the most important food sources. Deer, raccoons, wild turkeys, and even Florida black bears actively consume these berries in late summer. And it was these dark fruits that once attracted the attention of people who lived on these lands long before the advent of modern medicine. Because the indigenous peoples of Florida have long known that there was more to these berries than just food. They knew that this plant could help with diseases that appear in men with age. And they used it long before doctors started talking about hormones and enzymes. These are the berries that people who lived here long before modern cities have collected for centuries. Among them were tribes that are today called the Seminoles. They knew this plant well and used it not only as food. Saw palmetto berries were ground into a thick paste and used as a remedy for recovery from illness. It was given to those who had been unable to gain weight for a long time, felt weak, or suffered from chronic fatigue. But beyond this, the Seminoles developed various rituals and methods for preparing the berries to maximize their healing properties. The berries were carefully cleaned, the leaves were removed, and then they were pounded into a thick paste using stone or wooden mortars. Sometimes the paste was mixed with a small amount of animal fat or honey to improve the absorption of the active ingredients and extend the shelf life. People noticed that the plant's effect depended on the stage of ripening of the berries. Those that were too green were considered weaker, while those that were overripe lost some of their beneficial properties. The paste was given not only for chronic fatigue or weakness, but also to maintain men's strength during periods of intense work or after illness. Adult men were also advised to take approximately 1 tablespoon of the paste per day, divided into several doses, while children and adolescents were advised to take only half a serving. The elders believed that repeated use after a month enhances the effect, and the beneficial substances are absorbed by the body gradually. The paste and tinctures were also used externally. They were applied to the lower back for pain, and rubbed onto the chest and back for chronic fatigue. Fatty acids and phytosterols were believed to help restore strength even when applied externally. Often during their treatments, they would sing or walk among the palmetto bushes, turning the consumption of the berries into a familiar ritual that helped them relax and feel better. These traditions, passed down through generations, became a valuable source of knowledge for early American physicians. By the end of the 19th century, medicine was actively interested in plants used by indigenous peoples. Doctors traveled throughout the southern states, writing down prescriptions and observing local healers. Of course, it was saw palmetto that caught their attention because its effectiveness had been talked about too often. Patients noticed that after taking the berries, problems with urination became less pronounced. Some doctors began experimenting with tinctures and extracts of the plant. And pretty soon, saw palmetto began appearing in medical publications. It began to be mentioned in American reference books as a remedy for bladder inflammation, prostate problems, and some reproductive system disorders. Interest in the plant continued to grow, and at the beginning of the 20th century, an event occurred that finally cemented its place in medicine. In 1906, saw palmetto was officially added to the United States Pharmacopoeia. This meant that the medical community recognized the plant as a medicinal product. For doctors of the time, this was an important signal. If a substance was included in the Pharmacopoeia, it was trusted and considered to have been sufficiently studied. And that's how most doctors began to prescribe saw palmetto for diseases of the genitourinary system. Tinctures and liquid extracts were sold in pharmacies, and medical journals published descriptions of its use. It seemed that a plant used for centuries by Florida's indigenous peoples had finally found its place in evidence-based medicine. But that story changed just a few decades later. In the mid-20th century, saw palmetto suddenly disappeared from American medicine. And the strangest thing was that no one explained why this happened. But while in the United States the story almost ended there, in another part of the world, things developed quite differently. In Europe, particularly in France and Germany, interest in saw palmetto not only continued but began to grow, as researchers noted an important detail. The results from using the berries were inconsistent. In some cases, they actually helped, but in others they had almost no effect, and this led scientists to think that the problem might not be in the plant itself, but in how exactly it is used. It was then that attempts began to understand which substances in the berries were responsible for its action, and whether this effect could be made more stable. And it quickly became clear that the main active ingredients were not found in the pulp of the fruit. They are hidden in the fatty oil contained inside the berries, and it is this oil that has proven to be the most valuable part of the plant. This oil contains free fatty acids such as lauric, oleic, and myristic, as well as phytosterols, plant molecules that are structurally similar to human hormones. It was these substances that began to arouse the greatest interest among scientists. It gradually became clear that traditional tinctures and powders could not reliably deliver these substances to the body, because their content was highly dependent on how the berries were picked, stored, and processed. And then the researchers decided to take a different approach. Instead of using the whole plant, they began to extract only the oil fraction from the berries, which contains the main active compounds. This is how a new type of drug appeared: standardized lipid-sterile extract of saw palmetto. Unlike older tinctures, this extract allowed for precise control of its composition, primarily the fatty acid content, which was usually brought up to 85%. This was of fundamental importance because it was precisely this concentration that was considered necessary to obtain a noticeable effect. One of the first and most famous of these drugs was an extract called Permixin. It was developed in France by the pharmaceutical company Pierre Fabre in the 1970s, and, unlike regular supplements, it has undergone comprehensive medical testing. Its composition was standardized, clinical trials were conducted, and then it began to be prescribed to patients. By the 1980s, Permixin was already widely used in France, Germany, and Italy, primarily in men with enlarged prostates. It was at this moment that the history of the same plant finally split into two different paths. In Europe, saw palmetto has become a medicine with a controlled composition and predictable action. And in the United States, it gradually returned to the market in a different form, not as a drug, but as a dietary supplement. And this is where the next, much more complicated part of this story begins, because the difference between these two products turns out to be much deeper than it might seem at first glance. And it wasn't just that in one country it was considered a medicine, and in another just a supplement. They looked almost identical, were sold in similar packaging, and promised the same effect. But inside, things weren't so simple. Some capsules contained a truly concentrated extract with a high content of the necessary substances, while others contained ordinary berry powder, which contained much less of these substances. And for a long time, this difference was hardly taken into account. When large clinical trials began in the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s, the task seemed simple. It was necessary to understand whether saw palmetto helps with the symptoms of prostate enlargement or not. To do this, they recruited hundreds of patients, divided them into groups, gave one the drug, the other a placebo, and monitored the results for several months. Doctors monitored symptoms, frequency of urination, and general condition. These were full-fledged randomized studies, and it is precisely these types of experiments that are considered the gold standard in modern medicine. Everything looked perfect on the outside, but there was one problem on the inside that was barely noticed. Under the name saw palmetto, different forms of the product were used in these studies. Sometimes these were normal extracts, but more often they were ordinary supplements, the composition of which no one really controlled. Some capsules might contain a lot of active substances, while others might contain several times less. The difference was such that one product contained about 80% of the necessary components, while the other contained only 10%. Moreover, even the production method played a role, since different methods extracted uneven amounts of substances from the berries. In some places, the result was a rich extract, while in others, it was a practically empty mixture. And some studies simply used crushed berries, which contained a minimum of active substances. But in scientific papers, they all simply called it the same thing: saw palmetto extract, as if it didn't matter what exactly was inside the capsule. It turned out that scientists were testing not just one drug, but many different options at once, which were united only by the name of the plant. In one study, people might get a truly working extract, while in another, they might get a nearly empty one. The results of these studies were later combined, but convincing evidence of effectiveness was never found. The scientists found no significant difference between the groups and concluded that saw palmetto was ineffective. However, in practice, things weren't so clear-cut. And so another question arises: if it's only a matter of the quality of the extract, then why do some studies still show a weak or almost imperceptible effect? To understand this, scientists began to take a closer look at the disease itself for which these berries are taken. We're talking about benign prostate enlargement, a condition that develops in a very large number of men with age. But the problem is that this condition behaves very differently in men. For some people, symptoms remain relatively unchanged for years, while for others, they gradually intensify. Sometimes they can suddenly shrink on their own, even without treatment. This is what makes such studies particularly challenging. When scientists compare a group of people taking a drug with a placebo group, they sometimes find that improvement occurs in both. This may simply happen because the patient's condition stabilizes over time. Therefore, even if the extract does have a small effect, it can be quite difficult to notice it against the background of natural fluctuations in the disease, especially if the study lasts only a few months. In addition, modern medications used for prostate enlargement are quite powerful. Some of them reduce the size of the prostate, others relax the muscles around the urethra. Compared to these, the effects of plant extracts appear much milder, which is why many doctors today view saw palmetto a little differently than they did 100 years ago. It is rarely considered as a primary treatment, but is sometimes used as an adjunct, especially in the early stages when symptoms are not yet too severe. And it is here that the history of this plant returns once again to the place where it once began, to the small, dark berries that grow among the sandy plains of Florida, to a plant that people have used for centuries without knowing anything about hormones, enzymes, or clinical studies. And perhaps the strangest part of this story is that more than 100 years later, science is still trying to answer the same question. Does saw palmetto really help? Or maybe it's because for too long this name has been hiding completely different things. Today, the situation has become a little clearer, as several large reviews and meta-analyses of all clinical studies of saw palmetto have been conducted over the past decades, and the picture has turned out to be quite interesting. When studies were reviewed with various supplements of unknown composition, the results generally showed little or no effect. But when it came to the standardized lipid sterol extract, the effect was noticeable. About 30% of patients experienced an improvement in symptoms, while only 20% of those in the placebo group experienced an improvement. These improvements appeared gradually, usually after 4 to 12 weeks of regular use. Patients reported a reduction in nighttime toilet visits by 1 to 2 times per week, a decrease in the sensation of incomplete evacuation, and a decrease in weak urine flow. However, the effect remained mild compared to modern drugs. Alpha blockers or 5-alpha reductase inhibitors act faster and more powerfully, but often cause side effects such as dizziness, weakness, or decreased libido. Standardized saw palmetto extract, on the other hand, has virtually no serious side effects with occasional mild digestive upset. This is why many doctors today view such extracts not as a replacement for medications, but as a complementary therapy option. This is especially relevant for patients with early-stage prostate enlargement or for those who do not tolerate strong medications well and want to try more gentle treatments. It is here that it becomes clear why the same story develops so differently in different parts of the world. In Europe, most saw palmetto products are medically registered, meaning their composition is strictly standardized, and manufacturers are required to adhere to strict requirements for the content of active ingredients. When prescribing such a drug, a physician can be confident that the patient is receiving exactly the amount of fatty acids and phytosterols that have proven effective in clinical studies. In the United States, the situation is different. There, most saw palmetto products are sold as dietary supplements. This means they are more leniently regulated than medications. Manufacturers can use different processing methods for the berries and are not required to prove their effectiveness before selling them. There are dozens of variants on the market under the same name, which differ greatly in composition and concentration of active ingredients. This difference does not go unnoticed, and researchers note that in American studies the effect of saw palmetto is often underestimated precisely because of this variability. Some capsules may contain a nearly complete standardized extract, while others contain ordinary berry powder with almost no active ingredients. This, according to many experts, is the main reason for the long-standing controversy surrounding the plant and the conflicting conclusions about its effectiveness. Moreover, the difference in approaches reflects broader systemic differences in medicine. European pharmaceuticals tend to transform herbal remedies into drugs with controlled composition and predictable effects, while the American supplement market has historically been more freewheeling and oriented toward mass consumption. As a result, the same plant has become both a medicine in Europe and a controversial supplement in the United States. Today, saw palmetto remains one of the most popular herbal remedies in the world. Every year, millions of men continue to buy it in pharmacies and stores, some on the advice of doctors, others because they heard about it from friends or read about it online. And while scientific debate continues, one thing is certain. The history of this plant is a rare example of how the same remedy can undergo completely different fates in different medical systems. From the knowledge of the indigenous peoples of Florida to the pages of the American Pharmacopoeia and Disappearance from Medicine to return in the form of modern standardized extracts. The controversy over saw palmetto continues because the difference between a medicine and a useless supplement sometimes lies not in the plant itself, but in how it is used and regulated.